Back again YouTube, and welcome back to another video. And in today's video we're going to be actually looking at initializing our routing component. We're going to be making some adjustment from the last videos that we've done in terms of making some changes or adding some more method within our base controller class. We're going to be adding in a rouets.yaml file, and as I'm saying, we're going to be modifying our existing router class plus adding in a new router class as well that's going to do all the managing of all of our routes. So again, before we do that, I want to open up this session.yaml file which we created I think yesterday, and just want to show you I've done some reformatting. I've added in some description of what these are actually doing, so you've got a better understanding of what these keys and values are. So not to worry about that. I've also added in this block, which is something I want to implement at a later stage, and it basically gives us the opportunity to use different session storage. But again, don't worry about that for now. We won't be touching that right now. So yeah, I want to show you the session file, show you what I've done in it off screen, so you're not seeing it and thinking I've not seen that before. So now you've seen it. We're going to close out of that. And we're going to try and go through this as quickly as possible because we've got quite a lot to do. Right, so I'm going to create a new YAML file and I'm going to call it routes. And within that, I'm going to create two routes that's going to give us something to play with. And it's going to be an empty quote, tab over. I'm going to call the key is going to be controller, and the value is going to be ohm, denotes our ohm controller, and the action is going to be index. Right, and the next one I'm going to create is called login, be controller, and the class for this login route is going to be security, and the action I'm going to call it login. Right, we're going to come back to this in a minute and we're going to play around with it so I can better show you what it's actually doing. So I'm going to close that out. We're going to pop down to our router class. Let's delete that, I don't know what that is. And we're going to create that new routing, well, our next routing class. So I'm going to call this router manager.php. Right, I'm going to build this out and I'm going to explain to you what I'm actually doing. Okay, PHP declare strict types namespace magma. We're back into a router directory. I'm gonna call this router manager, right? And I'm going to extend our router class, and this class contains only that one method, and that one method is going to be a static method. I'm going to declare it as it's me a public function, public static function. I'm going to call this dispatch route. Did I spell that properly? Don't think I have. This patch route, yep, like that. This is going to take one argument, and it's going to be a string, and it's going to be that URL, right? So I'm going to instantiate my router class, and I'm going to bring in that YAML file that we've just created. So let me just bring that YAML manager class in, or that YAML config file in. The YAML, that's the magma, the YAML config. Let's bring our router class in as well. We don't need to because we're in that same directory, but again, I'm going to be explicit about it, and I'm going to be bringing that router class in. Right? So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to create an object of that router class. It's going to be router equal new router. Right? Now I also want to bring in those routes that we've just created, which is this file, and that is going to be coming through our YAML config. So I'm going to say routes equal YAML config file, and it's called routes. Right, so we know that this YAML config is going to parse that file and return an array, so we can actually iterate over that routes variable, which is now an array. Right, so I'm going to say if is array get away, which is routes, and is an empty routes. I'm going to loop over those routes and sort of like define the parameters. So I'm going to say create a variable where I'm going to store those parameters in. I'm going to call it args, initialize it with an empty array. I'm going to say for each routes as key route. Right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check if we've got a namespace set within that parameter, and then I'm going to define that parameter. So I'm going to say if is it, and it's going to be route namespace, and that namespace is an empty, which is route namespace is an empty. Then I'm going to say args equal namespace, and we want to get that namespace from that loop. Right? Just like that. Then we're going to say else if is it route, and that's going to be controller, and route controller is an empty. Then let's define those controller parameters as well. It's going to be args equal, I'm going to put this on a separate line just so it's a little bit more readable. So I'm going to say controller, get the controller from that route. Right? And then we're going to get the action as well. And it's going to be action. Right? So let me quickly walk you through what I've just done. So we've taken this YAML file, which is going to be returning an array of what you see right here. So we're checking if we've got a controller, that's the key, and that's the value. We're checking if we've got a controller key set, which we have. If we have, then we're going to define those parameters. Say controller, get the controller, action, get the action. So the action will be the index and the controller will be the ohm, right? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually check, make sure we've got a key. So is it key, then I'm going to get my router object, which is storing that router variable, and I'm going to call a method in my routing class. I'm going to show you that method. I'm going to call that add method. Say add, I'm going to pass the key in, right? Then I'm going to pass this entire argument, which is going to be the parameters, because remember, if I take you back to this router file, we're passing in the route as the first argument and the parameters as a second argument, which is this array right here, we're passing that in. And we didn't have to do it like this. We could have simple sort of like create an object of our router and then define each route line by line as we go along. But I wanted to simplify it. Well, I think it's a simplified way of doing it, because then you define your route within your YAML and it will automatically loop over those routes and add them into the routing table and set the parameters as well. So I quite like this way of doing it, and this is how I'm going to actually carry on doing it. So we've set our route. Then what we want to do next is actually this needs to be within our for each loop, right? Then I'm going to call a next method within our router class, which is our dispatch method, which is this method right here. So outside of the for each loop, I'm going to say router, because we don't want that to be in our for each loop. We want it to be outside of the loop. And to say dispatch, I'm going to pass in this actual argument, which is the URL, right? Just like that. And that's all this class is going to be doing. Now I'm going to execute this class within our application class and then pass in the required argument. So that looks fine. Yep. Right, let's jump back into our application class and add this in. So application, I'm going to go to the bottom of the file. Well, let's bring this in, bring the namespace in. Let's call it, it's called Magma Router. It's a router manager class. Right, I'm going to create a next method, and these are going to be test method, because at the minute I'm just returning an object of this class so we can chain onto it, but we're not actually doing no testing. So again, I'm going to keep it simplified for now, and then when we come to sort of like, when we say that we're quite happy with how it looks and how it's functioning, then we're going to come back and refactor this and make it a bit more secure, so we're not having errors peeling out here and there. So I'm going to create a next method called public function, and I'm going to call this set route set route handler, something like that. It's going to return self again, and it's going to return the object so we can chain onto this as well. And all I want to do within this method is call my router manager, and call that dispatch route method. And I'm going to create an argument in that, and I'm going to pass that argument within this dispatch route method, because that contains that one argument in here, and semicolon. Right, so I'm going to go back to my index file, and we're going to pop this in to say set route handler, and I'm going to pass in a query string, and it's going to be server query string, like that. What have we done? Let's get that back properly, and there we go. So I'm going to switch my screen and take it to my development page so you can see what's going on. Now I'm aware of yesterday that it was blocking your view somewhat, so I'm going to be keeping an eye on that monitor just to make sure that it's not blocking your view and you can see exactly what I'm seeing. Alright, so if I reload, we're getting an error saying 404 error, no page found, and that error is coming from our router. And is throwing this because there's no match, and there's no match because we said we're going to be calling our controller files and we're going to suffix it with the controller string, which is what we've defined in some of the first videos that we've done. And we've defined that class, or defined that property at the top of the class. So we need to like concatenate that onto this line right here, where it's getting the controller, which is, where are you, which is this actual value, right? So we want to concatenate that suffix onto this to be this controller suffix, and we're still going to get an error because we have not actually created that class yet either. So we're still getting that error. Let's actually go in and create some directory in our root directory, and I'm going to call it app. I'm going to create a couple more directories. I'm going to call this one controller singular, and let's just create a next one called model. It won't be working in this one yet, but I'm just going to create a model directory, and in there I'm going to create a home controller .php. Let's just build this out quickly. Strict type equal 1, namespace is going to be app controller. This namespace won't be relevant just yet. It will be relevant when we come to separating our application from our actual core code, but I'm just going to put it in for the sake of putting it in. Be class home controller, right? And we want to extend that base controller class that we've got within our base directory. Extend, that's going to be that base controller. You see it brings it in, right? And that base controller has got a constructor method, so we're going to create a constructor method and then pass the parent constructor in and pass that argument in. So I'm going to say public function construct, and the argument was that route params. If I open up my base, you see we've got that argument, that route params, which is coming from our router file, which is what we've defined right here. When we create a controller object, we pass in that params, which is what we got in the constructor right here. So we're creating a home controller. We're going to extend that base controller class, and we're going to pass back in. We're going to call a parent construct. I'm going to pass back in that route params. Right? So the next thing I want to do is create that index method. To say public function index, I'm going to suffix it with a action suffix, and I'm going to explain to you why I'm doing that in a minute. And I'm just going to echo out say home controller. Just going to leave that one for now. We're going to come back to that in a minute because we need to actually set up some other bits as well. And some of that bits that I want to come back to, I want to touch back onto my router class, and I want to sort of like work on this add method, because I did say back in some of the first video that this method is not quite finished, because we're going to be using regular expression to dynamically convert some variables that we're going to set within this add method, which is going to dynamically add route to our routing table. Especially when we come to add stuff like our admin controllers, we want that to be added in automatically for us. And if we use regular expression, we can do that pretty easily. But I'm not a regular expression expert. Anyone who is an expert in that, kudos to you, mate, because it's, yeah. But I know enough to get by, and I'm going to do it the way I've learned it, and that's how I'm going to implement it. So because we're using that query string, in our dispatcher, we need to sort of like escape any forward slashes. So I'm going to do that through regular expression using the PHP method preg replace. So I'm going to take that route from the argument, equal preg replace, and I'm going to put a pattern, replace it with that, and put my route in, because that's what we're replacing, right? And I'm going to say / back forward, right? Then back forward. And because we're using regular expression, we need to put on that starter and that delimiter. So I'm going to say route equal / caret. I'm going to concatenate that route in between the starter and delimiter. I'm going to say route concatenate, and it's going to be $, and the I, which is the case insensitive flag, semicolon. And let's see what we're getting back from that. If we're still getting an error, but we're getting a different error, and it's saying invalid method. So that tells me that we're calling a method that is not valid. So let's go back to my home controller, and we're calling index action. But if I take you back to my YAML file, which is this rouets.yaml file, you'll notice that the action method is only called index, but I'm calling it index action. Now I'm going to demonstrate to you something for a minute. I'm going to take that action off and see what happens. Reload, and there we go. We're hitting this index controller, and if I change that to, say, the coding workshop, reload, and there you go. We're getting that. We know we're hitting that index route, but we did create two routes, login and this home route. Let's go ahead and actually add in a next file and call it security, because that's what we call the actual route. We'll call it security controller. So it's going to be security controller.php, and this is what I'm referring to. The controller for the login route is called security, and the method is called login. So we're going to create that and see if we're going to be hitting that route as well. And again, it's going to be similar to this one. Just going to copy what's in here, paste it in, and change home to security. And let me point out as well, we're using this upper camel case notation, which we've defined, or which we have set up in our router class. And what else should I point out? Yeah, so our router class is actually converting. Let me close this down a bit. Converting right here using this method. That's converting to that uppercase, right? And you also notice that the controller is called security, but we've called it security controller. And again, back into our route, we define this suffix right here, yeah, which we've added on or concatenated onto that string, which makes it security controller. Then this method right here transform that into this uppercase that you can see, right? This camel uppercase, and that's how we're going to be writing all of our classes. So just to point that out, so we got our security controller. The method is called login. So let's type that method, and let's change that to login page, and let's reload. Yeah, fine. Let's put a / and hit that login route, and there we go. We're hitting that login route right here. So we know that is working fine, and we can add as much route as we want. But as I'm saying, we're going to be creating dynamic route using variables that we're going to convert into actual routes with regular expression, which is something we're going to be doing in a bit. So back into our home controller, initially we add this as index action, right? And if I go back to the home page, you see we're getting that error. So why are we getting that? Well, obviously we know why we're getting that error, because it's an invalid method. That's not what we've defined in our controller, in our YAML file, I should say. But the reason why I've done that is, if I take you, I'm going to take you back to the base controller class, because I'm going to be doing something in that class. Right. So the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to be able to execute some code or a block of code before I call a controller and after we call a controller. And you could refer to these as filters or action hooks or whatever. I mean, they're implemented in most popular framework, and this is going to be no exception. So what I'm going to actually do, I'm going to implement it again the way I learned it, and I'm going to use a PHP magic method called call. So I'm going to define that method just down here. Public function, it's going to be call, right? Back again, and well, we're back again. We've not left. I came to edit and realized that I was missing a clip. I thought I had it. Obviously, I didn't, and I must have not hit that record button. And I was there carrying away. I finished off this last bit because I think we ended on, I was creating a magic method from PHP called call, and as I was explaining that, I needed this method to help us inject some hook within our controller, so we could execute some code before and after we call that controller method. But obviously that clip, well, I thought I had it, it's gone. So I'm going to redo it. So I've deleted the method from the controller class, the base controller class, and from the home controller, because I actually want to do it so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to just redo this last bit and add it onto the video. So the public function call, right? And as I was saying, this is a PHP magic method, and what it does, it get execute when you're trying to call a method in a class that doesn't exist, or if you're trying to call a private or a protected method, this will get execute. So what we can do with that is we can actually reformat our index or our method in our controller class, like this method right here. We could rebuild that method, because remember what is trying to call that index action. So if I bring you back to this YAML file, it's trying to call this action, this index action, because that's what we've defined in that YAML control. So obviously it's going to execute that magic call method, because that index method does not exist, because we've called ours index action. And because we've done that, we now have the ability to modify that call so we can add hooks before and after. So I'm going to rebuild this method. I'm going to say method, and also this method actually contains two arguments, and the first is going to be the name, and the second is the argument that method contains, if it has any, right? So remember what I was saying, we're calling a method that does not exist, so that method is stored within this name, right, which is going to be index. So we're going to say method equal name, and I'm going to concatenate that action suffix on, which is going to be action, which is going to result in index action, right? Now I'm going to use a next PHP method or a function to check if that method exists within the current object. So I'm going to say if method exists this in that object method, right? If it does, I want to execute some code, and I'm going to create two separate functions in this base controller class, so I can then use them in my subcontroller classes. So I'm going to call these public function before, make these protected actually, right? And I'm not going to execute any code in these methods from this base class. I pretty much want to execute any code within the actual subclasses, so they're going to be empty. They're going to be empty method for the time being. And the next one is protected function after. Right? So I'm going to say within this method exists. If the method exists, then I want to execute this before method, and then use a callback function to call the actual method, then execute some code after. So I'm going to do if this before isn't false, yeah, mean that we're using that method. If it's not false, then we want to call user func array, and this takes two arguments. The first is going to be the array, and we're going to put this within that object and method, which is our newly formatted method. Then we're going to say arguments, which is the arguments from this actual call method we're passing in, semicolon. Then I'm going to call the after method, which is going to be this after, just like that, just like that. So we rebuilding or reconstructing that method, adding the action prefix on, yeah, checking that the method exists, and we calling the filters before, call a method, and then call some filters after. So if that method don't exist, we can throw an exception. It's going to be else, and it's going to be throw new base, and it's going to be base bad method call. And this is one of the method or classes that are created in the video that I thought I was recording, and it's actually in my base exception class, and all it's doing is extending PHP bad method call exception, right? And I think that's a more appropriate exception to use in this scenario right here. I'm going to say method concatenate that method cannot I'll say method does not exist in, I'm going to concatenate a next function called get class and pass in this. And what this does, whatever class we're using this method in, it will get the name of that class, and it will say something like, for example, method index action does not exist in the home controller, something like that. So that's the bit that got missed out. I've redone it now so you guys can see what I was doing, and I'm going to actually test this out. So if I go to the home controller, I'm going to demonstrate. Let me just refresh this page. We're getting our index action method, which we're hitting right there, and I'm going to do protected function before, and I'm going to say echo. I'm going to put this is before action hook. I'm going to put a little break line in as well, and let's copy this, paste it in, rename it to after, and I'm going to say this is the after action hook. And let me reload that page, and there we go. If you can see, we got the action hook before, the method name or the method that is being called, and the after action hook. So you can imagine what we can do with this. We can execute code before we call a controller, and there's going to be plenty of use cases for, well, are we going to implement it? For example, we can actually check that our route is protected before we call the route. And if it's not, we can redirect. We could redirect back to our login page. So this is going to be an effective method, which is going to give us the means to execute any code that we want before we call a controller. And the after method also provides us with the means to do something afterwards. So that's the bit that I missed out, and I actually wanted to pop it back in because I didn't want to do it then walk over it with you guys. I want you guys to see what I was doing, so and try and explain to you what it is. So thanks again for that. Please like, share, subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next video coming up pretty shortly. Thanks and bye.